I had never been prone to violence. All my life, I taught my son that fists don't solve problems, that true strength lies in patience. But when his face was covered in bruises again, and the school principal smiled and spoke of childish mischief, something inside me broke. I no longer saw a mother, a teacher, a neighbor. I saw a she-wolf, and once she went on the hunt, there was no stopping her. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Laura Peterson. I was 38 years old when it all began to shift beneath my feet. Though to the outside world, I looked like any other single mother in a quiet Ohio town. I worked long hours as a cashier in a large supermarket, counting every dollar and clipping coupons late at night just to make sure my son had what he needed. Our home was a modest rented house on the edge of town, with peeling paint on the shutters and a roof that moaned when it rained. It was not much, but it was ours, and it was the only place where I believed my son, Andrew, could feel safe. Andrew was 12, at that fragile age when the world decides whether to crush or shape a boy. He was small for his class, thin-shouldered with soft brown hair that never lay flat and eyes too large for his face. He carried a gentle presence, the kind that made him easy to overlook, and children at that age rarely forgive gentleness. I had raised him to be kind, to listen, to read more than he spoke. But in the echoing world of middle school, those qualities became wounds instead of strengths. I began to notice the signs long before I admitted them. His notebooks came home with pages missing, corners torn, and margins scribbled with things I wasn't meant to read. His jacket, a second-hand one I had patched twice already, grew stained with dirt that no laundry detergent seemed able to wash away. He began moving more quietly, shrinking into himself, as though to occupy less space would mean less trouble. Yet what unsettled me most was not the bruises that he tried to explain away with clumsy stories of tripping on stairs, but the silence. It was a silence that clung to him like dust after school. He no longer told me about his teachers, about the small victories in math, or the books he devoured in the library. Instead, he ate dinner in near wordlessness, pushing food around his plate, eyes drifting to some dark place beyond my reach. At night, I would hear him shifting in bed, restless, as though even his dreams had turned against him. One gray Monday, I left work early to pick him up. I told myself it was to surprise him, but in truth, I needed to see with my own eyes what the days were doing to him. I parked in front of the low brick building of the middle school, the American flag drooping in the damp wind, and walked inside. The receptionist gave me a polite nod, unknowing, as I wandered the halls lined with metal lockers. The floor smelled faintly of bleach and pencil shavings, that unmistakable perfume of public schools, and the fluorescent lights buzzed in long white rows above my head. The bell rang, and children poured out of classrooms, a sudden river of voices and movement, laughter, shouting, sneakers squeaking, the clatter of locker doors, so much noise that it almost masked the cruelty tucked inside it. I stood against the wall and watched. I saw Andrew emerge from his classroom last, clutching his books tight to his chest, shoulders rounded forward like a shield. He moved carefully, his eyes lowered, avoiding the rush of bodies as though every student was a potential strike. And then I saw it. The quick shove, the books falling from his hands, the smirks of boys who vanished into the crowd before any teacher could notice. Andrew bent down, gathered his things, and kept walking without a word. No complaint, no defense, only silence. The hallway swallowed him whole. I wanted to scream, but my voice froze. It was as if the walls themselves had conspired to keep me quiet, their beige paint and bulletin boards full of smiling student photos mocking me with their pretense of normalcy. I followed him from a distance, my footsteps soft on the waxed linoleum. Every corner of that hallway felt colder than the last. Posters about kindness and anti-bullying campaigns peeled from the walls, their bright slogans hollow against the reality I had just witnessed. A janitor passed me with a mop bucket, his face blank, and the smell of bleach grew stronger. Yet beneath it all, the stench of fear clung to the air, invisible but undeniable. When Andrew reached his locker, he struggled with the combination, his fingers trembling. Another boy walked by and muttered something sharp, something I could not hear, but I saw my son's shoulders flinch as though struck by the word itself. He shoved his books inside quickly and closed the locker with a metallic slam that echoed through the hall. He looked down both directions before moving again, as if he were a hunted creature checking for predators. I stood there, rooted, my heart pounding with helpless rage. I realized in that moment how utterly alone he was in that building. Teachers chatted in their classrooms, the principal's office door remained firmly shut, and children moved in packs, unaware or unwilling to see what was happening just beneath their noses. My son's suffering existed in plain sight, yet it was invisible, absorbed into the architecture of the school like another layer of paint on the cinder block walls. When he finally stepped outside into the fading afternoon, I stayed behind for a moment longer. The hallway was empty now, but its silence was unbearable. It was not the peace of quiet, but the suffocating hush of complicity, the kind of silence that allows cruelty to breed. I placed my hand on the cool metal of a locker and imagined the echoes of laughter that had filled it just moments before. I felt the weight of his bruises pressing against my chest as though they were my own. That night, as I watched him sit at our small kitchen table with his homework spread out before him, I could still hear the hollow hum of those fluorescent lights. I could still see the way he bent to gather his fallen books while the world streamed past without pausing. The silence of that school hallway lodged itself inside me like a stone, heavy and unmovable. It would not let me rest. It whispered to me long after the dishes were washed and the house grew dark. It told me that something had already begun, something that would not stop until I broke it. I did not yet know how far that silence would drive me, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that it would not release me until I answered it. The first time I noticed the bruise beneath his eye, it was a faint shadow, a smear of purple and yellow, as if someone had brushed him with paint and then tried to wipe it away. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, head lowered over his homework, his pencil tapping lightly against the page, and for a moment I thought it was just the trick of the light. But when he turned, the bruise revealed itself in full, a swollen crescent, tender and fresh. He muttered something about hitting the corner of his locker, his voice flat, rehearsed, the kind of excuse that had been polished in silence before being offered aloud. He would not look at me. His eyes slid sideways, landing on the table, the wall, anywhere but my face. There was a way he carried himself that unsettled me more than the bruise. His shoulders curled inward as if to make himself smaller, as though shrinking could render him invisible. He walked differently now, not with the light shuffle of a boy late for dinner, but with the careful steps of someone who expected the ground itself to betray him. His silence became its own language, and I learned to read it like scripture. The way his fork clinked against his plate, the way his breathing quickened when the phone rang, the way he lingered by the window as if measuring the darkness outside, all of it told me a story he would never put into words. I tried to seek answers where I could. At the grocery store, I stood in line behind another mother from his school and listened as she complained about field trip fees, her tone sharp and careless. I wanted to ask her if she had noticed anything, if her child had said anything about mine. But the words caught in my throat, and I only nodded, smiled faintly, and paid for our bread and milk. The world spun forward, oblivious to the bruise beneath my son's eye. The following week, another mark appeared, this one along his arm, hidden poorly beneath the sleeve of his jacket. He insisted it came from falling during gym class, but the explanation rang hollow. His face bore no complaint, only a weary kind of acceptance. It was not just the marks on his skin that haunted me, but the expression in his eyes, resigned, as if he had already accepted that this was what his days would hold. There was a depth of exhaustion in his gaze that no 12-year-old should have known. I brought my concerns to the school, carrying them like fragile glass. The guidance counselor nodded sympathetically, promised they would look into it, and sent me away with pamphlets about resilience and self-esteem. The principal smiled politely, his office decorated with banners celebrating academic achievement, and assured me that the school had a zero-tolerance policy on bullying. Yet their words dissolved as soon as I stepped into the parking lot, leaving me with nothing but the weight of their indifference. The bruises did not stop. Some were visible, others hidden beneath clothing, but his eyes always told me the truth. They were wide, restless, like an animal kept too long in a cage. They darted away when I tried to meet them, then returned with a plea that was louder than any cry for help. It was a look that asked, without words, why the world would not step in. It was the look of a child abandoned by the very people meant to protect him. At night, when I folded his laundry and placed it in neat piles, I would trace the worn fabric of his shirts, the fraying seams of his socks, the faint stains that never washed out. These ordinary items became artifacts of a battle fought daily, silently, without banners or witnesses. Sometimes I pressed my face into his pillow after he had fallen asleep, breathing in the faint smell of shampoo and fear, and felt my own tears dampen the fabric. I called the police once, my voice trembling as I explained what was happening. The officer on the other end spoke with practiced calm, telling me that unless there was a serious injury, it was a school matter. His words fell like stones, closing off yet another path. The silence after I hung up was heavier than the call itself, a silence that spread through our house, filling every corner, pressing against me like a weight I could not lift. Andrew began to avoid mirrors. In the mornings, when he brushed his teeth, he kept his eyes fixed on the sink, refusing to see the reflection of the boy he had become. I caught him once, glancing up, only to quickly look away as though the glass had betrayed him. His face was no longer the open canvas of childhood, but a surface layered with bruises, shadows, and something far more permanent, a fracture in his spirit. I started to wake earlier, making him breakfast before the sun had risen, just so he would have one moment of comfort before the day swallowed him. The smell of toast and scrambled eggs filled the kitchen, but even that warmth could not disguise the stiffness in his posture as he prepared to leave. He walked to the bus stop with his hands deep in his pockets, head bowed against a world that had already decided he was weak. I watched from the window, clutching my coffee cup, my fingers trembling, wishing I could shield him with the fragile walls of our home. The bruises became a calendar of suffering, each mark a date, each shadow a reminder of another day endured. They etched themselves not only onto his skin, but into my memory, branding me with the knowledge of my own helplessness. I carried those bruises with me to work, scanning groceries beneath the harsh light of the register, smiling at customers while my chest ached with a private grief. It was his eyes that broke me most, the way they reflected pain that was both immediate and ancient, a sorrow too old for a boy of 12. They were not just eyes full of bruises, but eyes full of unanswered questions, eyes that begged for a justice that refused to arrive. And every time I looked into them, I felt the bruise forming in me too, deeper than skin, in a place where no one else could see. When I first heard the boy's name, it lodged inside me like a weight that refused to move. It was spoken casually, whispered in passing by another parent at the checkout line, but the sound of it struck me with the force of a hammer. Suddenly, the faceless tormentor who had haunted my imagination took shape. He was no longer a blur in a crowded hallway or a shadow behind my son's bruises. He was a boy with a name, a family, and a place in this town. From that moment, every thought, every breath, carried the heaviness of that stone deep in my stomach. I began to notice him everywhere. I saw his mother at the grocery store, her hair perfectly highlighted, her clothes crisp and expensive in a way mine never were. She moved through the aisles with the air of someone who expected the world to part before her, a cart filled with organic produce and brightly packaged snacks. I watched the way the cashier's voice softened when she greeted her, the way people smiled in recognition. There was a confidence that clung to her, a certainty that nothing in this town could touch her or her family. I saw his father, too, in the parking lot outside the hardware store. He carried himself like he owned not only the lot, but the town itself, shoulders wide, voice booming across the space as he laughed with another man. His hands were thick and restless, his gestures loud, and he wore a belt buckle polished to a shine that seemed designed to catch the sun. There was pride in his stance, a pride that did not bend, and I could see its echo in the way his son carried his cruelty at school. Arrogance ran through their blood like a family heirloom. Each sighting pressed the stone deeper. At night, when I tried to sleep, my stomach ached with its weight. I would lie awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, and still feel the presence of that name inside me. It was as if I had swallowed a shard of the world, jagged and unyielding, and now it lived within me, reminding me with each breath that justice had failed. My son continued to return home with new marks, some hidden, others impossible to conceal. He said little, but the bruises spoke loudly enough. The silence of his suffering and the arrogance of his tormentor's family merged in my mind, creating a pressure that grew unbearable. I carried that pressure with me to work, where the beeps of the register and the shuffle of bills in the till blurred into meaningless noise. I smiled at strangers, handed them their change, and all the while felt the stone grinding inside me, a reminder that I was powerless, or perhaps too afraid to act. It became impossible not to compare our lives. Our little house leaned tiredly against the wind, its shutters rattling when storms came, its yard unkempt because I worked too many hours to tend it. Inside, the furniture sagged with age, second-hand pieces patched with care, but never new. Meanwhile, their home rose like a fortress in the better part of town, with trimmed hedges and cars that gleamed in the driveway. They lived above the consequences of the world, or so it seemed, and their son mirrored that untouchable stance in the school hallways where he ruled with mockery and fists. The stone in my stomach grew each time I imagined them sitting down to dinner at a polished table, their plates full, their laughter echoing against walls painted in warm colors. I thought of my son sitting across from me at our small table, pushing potatoes across his plate, his eyes avoiding mine. It was not envy that consumed me, but rage at the imbalance, rage at the indifference that allowed their child to harm mine without fear. I tried once more to speak to the school, but the words I carried were heavy, brittle. The principal leaned back in his chair, fingers folded, lips curved in that same tired smile. He spoke of programs, of policies, of patience. I heard none of it. All I could feel was the stone pressing harder against my ribs, cutting into the soft places of me, feeding on my helplessness. I walked out of his office trembling, my hands clenched so tight the nails left marks in my palms. As the weeks passed, I realized that the stone had changed me. I no longer moved lightly through my days. I carried myself stiffly, shoulders drawn in, as though to keep the weight from spilling outward. My patience at work thinned. I snapped at customers, misplaced money, dropped cans on the floor. My coworkers looked at me with concern, but I brushed them off. They could not understand what it was to live with such a burden, to feel a name lodged inside you like a wound that would not heal. Even ordinary moments turned into reminders. When I folded Andrew's laundry, I felt the stone pressing as I traced the threads of his torn shirts. When I packed his lunch, slipping in an apple and a sandwich, I thought of the jeers he would face before he even opened the bag. When I watched him walk to the bus stop, small and alone, I felt the stone anchor me to the ground, powerless to follow, powerless to shield. There were times I thought of confronting the boy directly, but I stopped myself. He was still a child, though one who had been given the freedom to wound. It was not him I hated, but the world that let him thrive in cruelty. Still, I could not stop picturing his smirk, the tilt of his head, the satisfaction he must have felt each time my son bent down to gather his fallen books. Those images joined the stone, making it larger, sharper, more unbearable with each day. One evening, I found myself standing at the sink long after the dishes were done, the warm water cooling around my wrists. The house was quiet, Andrew asleep in his room, and yet the stone inside me throbbed like a heartbeat. I pressed my hands against my stomach, as though I could push it out, as though I could rid myself of the burden. But it stayed, immovable, whispering truths I did not want to hear, that no one was coming to save him, that no authority would step in, that I alone bore the responsibility to act. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a towel worn thin, and stood in the dark kitchen, staring at the faint reflection of my face in the window. The woman staring back was no longer the same. Her eyes were harder, her mouth set. The stone had reshaped her, grinding away the softness that once defined her. She looked like someone waiting, someone holding back a tide that threatened to break at any moment. The boy's name lived inside me now, heavier with each breath. I knew that the longer I carried it, the less of myself would remain. It was not just a stone in my stomach anymore. It was becoming the core of who I was, pulling me towards something I had not yet dared to name. It happened on a day that had begun like any other, under a sky the color of dull steel. The wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and diesel from the passing school buses. I stood at the kitchen counter making Andrew's lunch, the familiar motions of spreading peanut butter, cutting the crust from his sandwich, placing an apple in the brown paper bag. These small rituals were my way of giving him comfort, but even as I folded the bag closed, a hollow ache spread through me. I sensed, though I could not yet name it, that something had shifted, that a thin thread somewhere in me was fraying. When Andrew came home that afternoon, he was not carrying his backpack. His hands were empty except for a crumpled note, damp from his sweat. His jacket hung off his shoulders like a curtain on a broken rod. His eyes were distant, clouded, and his lips trembled as if he were still biting back a sound. It was not a single bruise or cut this time, but an entire story written across his body. His hair was matted with something sticky, his shirt streaked with dirt, and what looked like milk spilled deliberately over him. He smelled of garbage and humiliation. He dropped the note onto the table. It was from the school nurse, written in a hurried script, explaining that Andrew had been involved in a minor incident and was sent home early. There was no mention of a punishment for anyone else, no explanation of why his belongings had been thrown into a dumpster, no apology. My eyes moved over the words, but they blurred into meaninglessness. All I could see was my son standing there, shrunken, hollow-eyed, clutching at the edge of the table as though it were the only solid thing left. I guided him to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He undressed slowly, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. Each layer of clothing revealed another smear of grime, another patch of skin reddened by a slap or a push. When the water finally hit his body, he flinched but made no sound. The steam rose between us, filling the small room with a fog that smelled faintly of soap and iron. I stood outside the curtain, my hands pressed against the sink, listening to the soft patter of water on tile and the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Later, as he sat on his bed wrapped in a towel, I brought him a cup of tea. His eyes avoided mine, fixed on some distant point beyond the wall. He sipped without speaking, and a drop of tea rolled down his hand unnoticed. I wanted to hold him, but there was a stiffness in him now, a protective shell that even my arms could not penetrate. It was not just pain I saw, but shame, and it carved a hollow space inside me where rage began to pool. I called the school again. The secretary transferred me to the principal's office, where his voice came through the lines smooth and measured, full of words like investigation and ongoing process. He spoke of boys being boys, of character-building experiences. My fingers clenched around the phone so tightly that my knuckles ached. I tried the police once more, and the dispatcher's voice carried the same polite indifference as before. Unless there was serious injury, unless there was a weapon, their hands were tied. The phrases repeated like a lullaby for the powerful, soothing themselves while children bled. That evening, the house grew quiet. The clock in the hallway ticked with exaggerated slowness, each second echoing off the walls. Andrew lay in his room, the door ajar, his breathing shallow but steady. I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared, staring at the wood grain as if it could tell me what to do. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow over the worn linoleum floor. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked and then fell silent. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more softly, as if it too were waiting. I thought about every phone call I had made, every email sent, every meeting where I had sat in a plastic chair while administrators spoke of policies and patience. I thought of the other parents with their casual shrugs, the teachers who looked away, the officers who closed their notebooks. I thought of Andrew's eyes as he walked through the front door that day, The way they carried not just pain, but a question I could not bear to answer. Why no one would help him? Each memory dropped into me like another stone in a bucket, the water rising, the weight becoming unbearable. The night deepened. The kitchen smelled faintly of dish soap and the cooling remnants of dinner. I placed my palms flat on the table, feeling the grooves worn into the wood by years of use. My heart beat steadily, but there was a tremor in my arms, a vibration I could not stop. It was as if the bucket inside me had reached its limit, as if one more drop would send it spilling over. I stared at the wall clock. Its hands crawled toward midnight, and in their slow movement, I felt a terrible clarity. I rose and walked to Andrew's room. He had fallen asleep, one hand curled near his face, his body small under the blanket. A faint bruise marred his cheek, a dark crescent in the low light. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and felt the heat of his skin. My throat tightened. I wanted to whisper that it would be all right, but the words would have been a lie. The truth was that the world had left him unprotected, and I had allowed it to happen by believing in a system that had never cared. I returned to the kitchen and stood by the window. Outside, the street was empty, the streetlights casting pools of yellow light onto the pavement. A thin mist had begun to fall, blurring the outlines of parked cars and mailboxes. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. A woman with hollow eyes, her shoulders rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. I did not recognize her at first. She looked like someone who had been waiting too long, someone who had finally run out of faith. The last drop fell quietly. It was not an event, but a realization, a cold, steady understanding that no one else would act. The school would not change, the police would not intervene, and the parents of the boy who tormented my son would continue their lives untouched. The stone that had lived in my stomach shifted then, pressing outward, transforming from weight into momentum. I did not yet know what form my action would take, only that it was coming, inevitable as a tide. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a long moment in the dark, listening to the sound of Andrew's breathing down the hall. The house smelled of damp air and faint tea leaves. My hands curled into fists at my sides. The woman in the window was no longer a stranger. She was me, and she had reached the edge of waiting. The night I walked out of my house, the sky hung low and heavy, as if pressing down on the earth itself. The air tasted metallic, like water from an old pipe, and the street was washed pale by the sodium glow of the lamps. I wore my oldest coat, the one with the frayed cuffs, and stuffed my hands deep into its pockets to hide the tremor already beginning there. Each step I took down the cracked sidewalk seemed to echo louder than it should have, like a confession spilled in an empty church. The mist clung to my skin, soft and cool, and every breath I drew felt like swallowing smoke. I did not have a plan, only a direction. The stone in my stomach had grown restless, shifting inside me until it became motion. My hands were not steady. They fluttered when I tried to close them, as though my body understood before my mind that I was crossing a line from which I would not return. Still I walked, past the closed gas station with its flickering sign, past the row of houses where curtains glowed blue from television light, past the mailbox where a stray dog slept curled into itself. The town felt asleep, but I could hear a pulse beneath it, something raw and living, and it matched the beat of my own heart. The boy's house was in the newer part of town, where the lawns were trimmed and the fences freshly painted. I had been there once before on a school fundraiser night, standing awkwardly among women with manicured nails and soft perfumes. It looked the same now, even in the mist. White siding, dark shutters, a porch light left burning like a beacon for a ship that had no right to land. Their cars gleamed in the driveway, droplets of moisture catching the light like beads of glass. Everything about the place suggested safety, comfort, invulnerability. It was the opposite of what my son's life had become. I stood across the street for a long moment, my breath rising in pale clouds. My hands twitched in my pockets, the tremor stronger now, a low current of fear and rage winding through my arms. I thought of Andrew's face the day he came home without his backpack, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. I thought of every phone call ignored, every polite smile from an administrator, every time I had been told to wait, to be patient. The weight of those memories pressed against my chest until it was hard to breathe. When I stepped off the curb, the sound of my shoes on the asphalt was small but decisive. The mist deepened around me, softening the edges of the houses, muffling the world until all that existed was the path ahead. My heart thudded in my ears, and my hands began to shake so violently that I pulled them out of my pockets and clasped them together, fingers interlaced, as if in prayer. They did not still. They quivered like wings of a bird trapped against glass, and for a moment I wondered if my body would betray me entirely. I crossed the yard slowly. The grass was damp, brushing against my ankles, and the smell of wet earth rose around me. A wind stirred and carried with it the scent of cut wood from somewhere far off, sharp and clean. I climbed the porch steps, the boards creaking under my weight, each sound amplified in the quiet night. My hands reached for the railing, gripping it tight enough for splinters to press into my palms, grounding me in the present, in the reality of wood and skin. Still they trembled, small spasms running up my forearms, but I did not let go. I stood before the door, my reflection faint in the glass panel. I saw a woman I barely recognized, eyes dark, mouth a thin line, hair damp against her forehead. Her shoulders were squared, but her hands, raised slightly, quaked as if holding invisible weight. It was not just fear, it was everything. Years of exhaustion, weeks of helplessness, the ache of watching a child suffer without relief. All of it had settled into my hands, making them traitorous, unable to stay still even now, when stillness was what I needed most. In my coat pocket lay the object I had brought, a photograph of Andrew on his first day of school, smiling shyly in his too big backpack. I had taken it from the fridge before leaving, slipping it out from under a magnet. I had not planned to, but my fingers had reached for it automatically, as though they knew I would need it to remember why I was here. The edges of the photo were soft from years of handling, and as I touched it now, my hands shook harder, the tremor spreading from my fingertips up into my chest. I thought of turning back. The thought came and went like a flicker of light, weak and brief. The street behind me was empty, the mist curling around the lampposts, but I felt as though the whole world watched from behind closed curtains, holding its breath. My hands pressed the photograph flat against my palm. The paper was warm from my skin. The trembling was no longer just in my hands but in my legs, my breath, my voice, though I made no sound. I reached for the doorbell and hesitated. My index finger hovered above it, trembling so violently that I lowered my hand and steadied it against the door frame. The wood felt cool and smooth under my skin, and I pressed my forehead to it for a moment, eyes closed, trying to breathe. My heart raced, each beat a drum of inevitability. The tremor in my hands had become a rhythm of its own, a signal that I was about to step out of the person I had been and into someone I did not yet know. The porch light buzzed faintly above me, a halo of insects circling in its glow. My coat was damp now, heavy with mist, and my fingers slipped as I tried to adjust it. I curled my hands into fists and released them again and again, as if trying to wring the trembling out, but it clung to me like a second pulse. In the quiet, I could hear my son's voice as it had been when he was younger, calling for me from another room, trusting that I would come. That memory steadied me just enough to lift my hand once more. I stood there, fists unclenched, palms open, feeling the tremor run through me like an electrical current. My reflection in the glass no longer looked like a stranger. It looked like a mother whose patience had turned to resolve, whose fear had become a weapon sharper than anger. My hand still trembled, but now it felt less like weakness and more like transformation, the tremor of someone about to cross a threshold. I pressed the doorbell. The chime rang inside the house, muffled but clear, and for a heartbeat the trembling in my hands ceased entirely. The sound hung in the air, fragile as glass, and then the tremor returned, deeper than before, but I did not lower my arms. I stood waiting, the mist curling around my ankles, my hands quivering like leaves in a storm, knowing that nothing would be the same once the door opened. They led me away in silence, as if the act itself had drained the world of sound. My wrists were cold inside the cuffs, the metal biting against my skin with a dull familiarity I hadn't expected. The hallway outside their house smelled faintly of lemon polish and warmed carpet, and as the front door closed behind me, it was as if I had stepped out of their world and back into mine, a world where consequences arrived not with sirens, but with silence. The squad car was already parked at the curb, its lights flashing quietly, not in drama, but in routine. One of the officers asked if I needed a jacket. I told him I had one. I didn't mention that it was already damp with sweat, mist, and something that might have been grief. My legs moved without protest. I sat in the back seat like I had been there before, though I hadn't. Not physically, but some part of me had always known it would end like this. The ride was short, and the windows blurred the world outside into streaks of orange and gray. Trees, mailboxes, the rusted stop sign near the school, all slid past like scenery in a play I no longer believed in. I watched without focus, my reflection faint in the glass, lips parted slightly, as if I were waiting for a word that never came. The inside of the cruiser smelled of vinyl and time. The seatbelt hung beside me, unused. I did not ask for it. At the station, the light was too bright. The kind of light that exposed, peeled back, left nothing hidden. They took my fingerprints, my photograph. They asked questions in voices that were practiced, detached. I answered them all, slowly and clearly, because I had nothing left to hide. They placed my belongings, wallet, keys, the photograph of Andrew, into a clear plastic bag and set it aside on the counter. I asked them not to fold the photo. One of them nodded. The cell was colder than I expected. Not physically, though the concrete did little to hold warmth, but cold in its intent. There was no comfort to be found in that room, not in the thin mattress, not in the metal toilet, not in the silence that followed after the door clicked shut behind me. I sat on the cot, hands folded in my lap, and stared at the wall. There was a stain near the floor, old and dark. I watched it for hours, as though it might reveal something I had missed. Time collapsed in there, It lost its shape. I couldn't tell whether it was morning or night. Meals came and went, trays slid through a slot in the door, food that smelled of nothing and tasted of less. I ate because my body required it, not because I felt hunger. I slept in pieces, my dreams full of doorbells and Andrew's voice calling from far away. I woke each time with the same tightness in my chest, the same dry ache behind my eyes. The arraignment came quickly. My lawyer was appointed by the court, a young man with tired eyes and a voice that trembled more than mine had on the porch that night. He asked me questions I already knew the answers to. He wanted to know if I had been provoked, if I had a history of mental illness, if there had been threats. I shook my head. The only thing I had was a history of being ignored. He scribbled notes in a folder already overstuffed with strangers' pain. The courtroom was beige and stale, like it had been built to forget. I stood where they told me to stand. I listened to the charges: assault, trespassing, endangering a minor. The words stacked like bricks around me. I answered with "Yes, Your Honor," and "No, Your Honor," and at no point did anyone ask why I had gone to that house, why I had stood on that porch with hands trembling not from hate, but from love distorted by desperation. They spoke of justice, of process, of law. No one spoke of Andrew. No one mentioned the bruises, the note from the school nurse, the phone calls that led nowhere. No one asked why a mother would end up on a stranger's porch with nothing in her hands but a photograph. My son's name was never said, not once. It was as if he did not exist in that room, as if the pain that birthed the act had no place in the record. The media came, of course. They always come when it's too late. Reporters stood outside the courthouse, their microphones pointed like knives. The headlines wrote themselves: Local Mother Attacks Child, Vigilante Parent Faces Charges, School Bullying Turns to Violence. I saw my face on the television in the holding room, my mugshot beside stock footage of playgrounds and school buses. The narration spoke of my crime, but not of my child. The trial was waived in favor of a plea. The evidence was straightforward, the facts unkind. I took the deal: lesser sentence, no contest, community service, probation, counseling. I accepted it all without protest. There was no version of justice that would have included the full truth. That much had become clear. I returned home to a neighborhood that had turned cautious. Some looked away. Others watched too closely. A few women from the church left casseroles on my porch, not out of kindness, but out of obligation. I placed them in the freezer, unopened. The house was smaller now, or maybe I was. Each room echoed differently, as if the walls had forgotten our laughter. Andrew stayed with my sister during the ordeal. When he came back, he was quieter, older. We didn't speak much at first. He moved carefully around me, uncertain. I understood. I had become a question he did not know how to ask. I made him dinner, folded his clothes, left notes in his backpack like I used to. He read them, but he never mentioned them. His eyes were softer than mine, less burdened, but they watched me with a new kind of awareness, a sadness I could not touch. In the months that followed, I fulfilled my community service. I swept floors in city buildings, sorted paper in silent rooms, stood in corners wearing reflective vests. People looked at me as if I were an object being corrected. I kept my head down. I counted the hours. I let the shame settle like dust on my skin. But no amount of sweeping could clean what had been done. Redemption never came. Not in a headline, not in a court ruling, not in the eyes of strangers. It didn't wait for me at the end of my sentence. It didn't arrive like forgiveness in the mail. There was no moment when I felt healed, no catharsis, no absolution. There was only the quiet rhythm of days, one after the other, like rain on an endless roof. But sometimes, in the evening, I would sit on the edge of Andrew's bed while he slept. I would listen to his breathing, steady and slow, and I would remember the nights when it came in sobs and gasps. And in those moments, even without redemption, I found something close to peace, not because the world had changed, but because I had refused to do nothing, even if the cost was everything.